The dress had fit perfectly 3 weeks ago. Freya Dunstan stood in the hotel bathroom, one hand braced against the marble countertop, and reminded herself of that. 3 weeks ago, the emerald silk had skimmed her curves in a way that made her feel like somebody. Not the overworked junior archivist who ate lunch at her desk and owned exactly one pair of heels she could walk in. 3 weeks ago, she'd bought the dress on impulse after her mother called to ask how the diet was going, and she'd wanted, just once, to feel like the answer didn't matter. Now she was standing in the bathroom of the Fairmont Royal York with a line of women outside the door, probably all a size 4, and she couldn't stop hearing what Owen had said. "You're lucky this is a charity event, Freya. At least the cameras are required to be flattering." He'd said it quietly. That was the thing about Owen Parrish. He never raised his voice. He said cruel things the way other people said good morning, with the same practiced casualness, and then looked genuinely confused when your face changed. They'd been together for 2 years. She'd spent most of them learning to keep her face from changing. She hadn't cried. That was something. She'd smiled, excused herself to the bathroom, and now she was gripping the edge of a sink in downtown Toronto while the gala hummed on without her. The Pemberton Foundation annual gala was not the kind of event Freya normally attended. She was here because her boss, Dr. Anita Chowdhury, had food poisoning and had handed Freya the invitation with a manila envelope of notes and said, "Just smile and don't correct anyone's citations." The foundation funded historical preservation projects across Ontario, which meant it funded the archive where Freya spent her days in temperature-controlled rooms with white cotton gloves, handling letters written by people who'd been dead for a century. It was, she genuinely believed, the best job in the world. Owen had laughed when she'd told him that on their first date. She looked at herself if in the mirror now. The emerald dress, the dark hair she'd actually done properly for once, pinned up with a few strands loose the way the YouTube tutorial had shown her. The reading glasses she'd forgotten to swap for contacts. She looked, she decided, like herself. Slightly disheveled, slightly too much of everything, and that was fine. That had always been fine until Owen started narrating her. She dried her hands, straightened her back, and walked out. The ballroom of the Royal York was the kind of room that made people feel like they were in a film. Gold and cream, chandeliers throwing warm light across 100 circular tables, the low murmur of important conversations layered under a string quartet playing something Freya recognized as Debussy and was quietly pleased about. She collected a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. She wasn't drinking tonight, not with Owen already in a mood, and found a quiet corner near a window that overlooked Front Street. Outside, the city moved, cabs and streetcars and people in ordinary clothes going to ordinary places. She watched them for a moment and felt something loosen in her chest. 3 weeks ago, the dress fit perfectly. It still fit. Owen was wrong. Owen was often wrong about things he stated as facts. She was working up the resolve to go find her table when she heard him. Not Owen. Someone else. The voice came from just behind her right shoulder, low and unhurried, the kind of voice that assumed it would be listened to. "The Debussy is a strange choice," it said. "For a room full of people trying to impress each other." Freya turned. The man standing a few feet away was looking at the string quartet, not at her. He was tall. Not theatrically tall, just the kind of tall that reordered a room slightly, in a dark suit that didn't have a single unnecessary detail about it. His jaw was set at an angle that suggested he found most things mildly interesting and nothing particularly surprising. He had a glass of something amber in one hand and the expression of someone who had attended a great many galas and made peace with all of them. "Debussy makes people feel cultured without requiring them to think," Freya said before she'd decided to say it. Which is exactly what a room full of people trying to impress each other needs. He turned to look at her then. His eyes were a pale grey, the colour of Lake Ontario in November, and they were paying attention in a way she wasn't used to from strangers at events like this. "Fair point," he said, "though it also means anyone who actually knows Debussy has to spend the evening listening to him being used as furniture." "Welcome to preservation fundraising," she said. "Everything beautiful becomes decor eventually." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement that one was warranted. "Constantin Aldrich Vieira," he said, and extended his hand. I'm told I'm one of the evening's major donors, which I mention only because it explains why I'm standing in a corner looking antisocial. Freya Dunstan, she said, and shook it. His grip was firm without being demonstrative. Junior archivist, Chowdhury Historical. My boss has food poisoning, which explains why I'm standing in a corner looking antisocial. Chowdhury Historical, he repeated. He actually seemed to know what it was. The King Street Collection. You know it? I funded part of the digitization project 2 years ago. He looked at her with renewed attention. You worked on that? I was on the metadata team, she said. I personally catalogued about 400 letters from a 19th century Toronto alderman who wrote to his wife every week he was away on business and never once mentioned anything but the weather and his digestion. That sounds riveting, she said. It genuinely was. You can track the entire history of an intestinal complaint across 6 months of municipal policy. It's remarkable, he laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one, slightly abrupt, like it had caught him off guard. She felt absurdly pleased about it. They talked for 20 minutes. She wasn't entirely sure how. It was the kind of conversation that found its own momentum, moving from archival ethics to the problems with digital preservation to whether the distillery district had been ruined or saved by the development in the early 2000s. He had opinions, not performative ones, the kind people deployed at events to seem interesting, but actual positions arrived at through actual thought, and he didn't soften them for her, which she liked. She'd nearly forgotten about Owen entirely when she heard him. There you are. Owen materialized from the crowd with the precise timing of someone who'd been watching and chose his moment. He was handsome in the way that had once felt like luck. Square jaw, expensive haircut, the easy confidence of a man who'd never had to wonder if he was welcome in a room. He looked at Freya first, then at Constantine, and something moved through his expression that he covered quickly. Owen, she said, I was wondering where you'd disappeared to. He smiled at Constantine, the professional one he used on clients, Owen Parish, Development Consulting, Constantine Vieira. No elaboration, no offer of context or warmth. Owen's smile stayed in place. You two know each other? We were just talking, Freya said. She was explaining why the Debussy was a reasonable choice, Constantine said, which was not what she'd said, but she didn't correct him. Owen laughed, a light, social laugh, and then put his hand on the small of Freya's back in the way he did when he wanted to establish something. I was actually just looking for Freya because I wanted to introduce her around. She tends to disappear into corners at these things. He said it to Constantine, not to her, as though she were a fact being explained. You know how it is. I don't actually, Constantine said. His voice had not changed in temperature. It was still unhurried, still even, but something in it had shifted in a way Freya felt more than heard. She seemed entirely comfortable where she was. Owen's hand stiffened slightly on her back. She always says she is, he said, and laughed again, lighter this time. But Freya needs a bit of managing at events, don't you? He glanced at her. She gets in her head. The word managing landed the way it always did, quietly, without visible impact, leaving a bruise she wouldn't inventory until later. I'm fine, actually, she said. You've barely eaten, Owen said. And you've been hiding in corners for an hour. He said it to Constantine again, in the tone of you understand, don't you? She's a project. I'm always telling her she needs to put herself out there more. She sells herself short. It's a confidence issue, Owen. She said it evenly. I'm just saying. I know what you're just saying. The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. Then Constantine said, in exactly the same unhurried tone he'd used to discuss everything else. What did you call her? Owen blinked. Sorry. A moment ago. What did you say to her? I was just talking about her confidence before that. At the window. He nodded toward the windows overlooking Front Street where Freya had been standing when Owen first appeared. I was nearby. I heard what you said to her before she came back inside. Freya went still. She hadn't seen Constantine near the windows. She'd thought she was alone. Owen's expression recalibrated, something careful sliding into place behind it. I don't know what you think you heard. I heard you clearly, Constantine said. He wasn't speaking loudly. He didn't need to. There was a quality to his voice in that moment, a precise stillness that made the surrounding noise pull back from it. You said she was lucky the event cameras were required to be flattering. Owen opened his mouth. "Don't," Constantine said, "simply that." Owen closed it. "You said it to her the way you'd say something forgettable, like a footnote." Constantine set his glass down on a nearby table with a small, decisive sound. "And then you followed her inside to put your hand on her back in front of a stranger, and you called her a project." "That's not," Owen started. "Her name is Freya Dunstan," Constantine said. "She spent 2 years cataloging archival records most people in this room couldn't locate on a map, and she can identify a Debussy piece by the second measure, and she is standing here listening to you explain her to me like she isn't." He picked up his glass again, looked at Owen with the same steady attention he'd given everything else, and somehow that, the complete absence of heat, was worse than anger would have been. "You can leave now," Owen laughed, short and sharp. "I'm sorry." "You can leave the conversation," Constantine said. "That's what I mean. Leave it." The string quartet had shifted to something else, revel, maybe. The party continued around them like a tide that didn't know a particular shore had changed. Owen looked at Freya. She met his eyes and said nothing, because she didn't have to, because for the first time in 2 years she was standing next to someone who had said the things she'd never been able to say, and it had had out the words were just words, plain and clean, and the world had not ended. Owen left. Freya stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't have to do that, I know," Constantine said. "He's going to be unpleasant about it later, probably. I'm serious. He doesn't handle being..." Freya, her name in his mouth, calm and clear. "I know. It doesn't change anything." She looked at him. At the steady grey of his eyes, the complete absence of drama in his expression, like what had just happened was simply a thing that had needed to happen and he'd been the person nearby to do it. No performance. No waiting for her to be grateful. She exhaled. "Okay," she said. "Okay, are you hungry?" he asked. "Because I haven't eaten since this morning and the canapés look genuinely poor and I noticed a place on King Street that does late-night pho." Freya looked at him for a moment. "It's February," she said. "It's absolutely faux weather." "It's always faux weather in Toronto," he said. "That's not controversial." The gala continued around them as they found their coats, and Freya noticed that a few people tracked Constantine across the room, with the particular attention reserved for people who controlled significant resources in a city. But he moved through it the way he did everything, without announcement, without adjusting his pace for observation. Outside, on King Street, the cold hit them like a clean fact, the kind that didn't leave room for anything else, and she could see her breath and the streetcar tracks gleaming under the light and people walking with their hands in their pockets, and she thought, "This is real. This is just a normal evening. Something just changed." The restaurant was small and warm and smelled like star anise and long-cooked broth. They sat across from each other at a small table and ordered, and Constantine asked her how she'd gotten into archival work, and she told him about her grandmother's collection of letters from the Blitz, written by a Toronto nurse stationed in London, found in a shoebox in a house in Hamilton, handed to a 12-year-old Freya who'd read them in a single afternoon and felt something unlock. "She wrote about the ordinary things," Freya said, "not the bombings, about what she missed. The smell of the lake in August, a specific brand of biscuits you couldn't get in England, the way the light hit certain streets in the early morning. The terror was in the background, the love was what filled the pages." She turned her water glass in her hands. "I wanted to take care of things like that. Letters that nobody thought to save because they weren't the famous ones." He was quiet for a moment. "Nobody's been taking care of the Vieira Foundation records," he said. "We have 4 decades of correspondence, grant documentation, project files. It's all in storage in a building in Liberty Village that I'm told smells vaguely of damp and good intentions." She looked at him. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm telling you about a problem," he said. "The job part is up to you. You don't know my credentials. I know you identified a Raval piece in a ballroom while someone was being condescending to you," he said. "And I know you were the lead cataloger on the King Street metadata project, which I read the report for and which was notably excellent. I did my research before tonight, Freya. Dr. Chowdhury mentioned your name in her correspondence, favorably." Freya set down her spoon. "You knew who I was before we talked," she said. "I knew your professional record," he said. I didn't know you'd be standing by the window talking about Debussy being used as furniture. That part was luck." He met her eyes, or good fortune, depending on which word you prefer. The broth was perfect, deep and clear at the same time, the kind that took hours and showed it. Outside, the February street went about its business. Inside, Freya sat across from a man who had heard what Owen said and had named it out loud, simply and without ceremony, and hadn't waited to see if she deserved it first. She thought about the dress, about the bathroom, about the 100 judgmental eyes she'd imagined and the one pair of real ones that had watched her from a corner, and decided, for reasons she didn't entirely understand yet, that she was worth knowing. "Good fortune," she said. "I think that's the right word." She started at the Vieira Foundation 6 weeks later. The storage facility in Liberty Village was exactly as advertised. A large, climate-inadequate room full of filing boxes in varying states of organization, with a leak stain on the ceiling that had clearly been there since before the concept of the foundation itself. Freya stood in the doorway on her first morning and felt, with complete sincerity, that it was one of the more beautiful sights she'd ever encountered. She put on her white gloves and began. The records were extraordinary. 4 decades of Vieira family philanthropy, arts funding, indigenous language preservation projects, community land trusts, a long correspondence with a Mi'kmaq cultural organization in Nova Scotia that had produced, over 30 years, the most remarkable archive of collaborative decision-making Freya had read. The family had been careful with language. The letters were specific, attentive, occasionally funny. Someone in the previous generation had a gift for the turn of phrase, and Freya began flagging them in her notes the way she used to flag her grandmother's nurse's letters. This one says something real. Constantine came by on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks in, unannounced. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room which Freya had reorganized by period and subject matter, the boxes now labeled in her precise handwriting, a long table set up with archival tissue and her cataloging system laid out in a row. "It's different," he said. "I hope that's an observation and not a complaint," she said, without looking up from the file she was transcribing. "It's an observation," he said. "Can I look?" "Wash your hands and don't breathe near the correspondence from the 1980s, she said. "The paper's fragile." He did as directed. She kept working. He moved slowly through the room, reading labels, occasionally stopping to look at something she'd flagged, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind. Not a silence waiting to be filled, but one that simply existed, like the room was large enough for 2 people thinking different things in the same direction. "This correspondence with the Mi'kmaq Cultural Institute," he said after a while. "My grandfather started it." "I know he was good at listening. It comes through in the letters." She paused. "He always asked what they needed, not what he wanted to give. There's a difference." Constantine said nothing for a moment. When she glanced up, he was looking at one of the flagged letters with an expression that was, she thought, something to do with grief. Not current grief, but the particular variety that surfaces when you find evidence of a person's goodness after they've been gone long enough that you'd started to wonder if you were misremembering. She went back to her work and said nothing, because some things didn't need a response. Owen texted her twice in those 6 weeks. Once to say that he'd been thinking about things and felt she'd been distant lately, and maybe they should talk. Once to say that he'd heard she'd taken a new position through someone in the Pemberton Foundation network, and that he hoped she knew what she was doing. Because the Vieira Foundation was not exactly a prestigious posting and he'd hate to see her waste the connections she'd made. She didn't reply to either. She told Martine, her best friend since second year at U of T, over ramen in Kensington Market on a wet Wednesday evening. Martine listened, drank her Sapporo, and then said with the directness that had made her both an excellent friend and a formidable emergency room nurse, "You've been letting that man narrate your life for 2 years. Good. Now don't." "I'm not," Freya said. "Good," Martine said. "Also, tell me more about the foundation guy. I work for him." "That's not what I asked." Freya ate her ramen and did not look at Martine, because Martine was difficult to mislead and had known her for 11 years. She stopped. "He doesn't adjust for people. You know how some people in positions like his, they have this performance of being personable. this deliberate warmth that's actually just a tool. She turned her chopsticks. He doesn't do that. He's exactly the same with me as he is with his foundation board. He just listens, and then he says what he thinks. He stood up for you at a gala when he'd known you for 20 minutes, Martin said. That was different. Was it? Freya didn't answer. The first time he called her by name with that particular quality, the one that was different from professional and different from polite, was in early April. She'd been working late on the Micmac correspondence, cross-referencing it with related documentation from the provincial archives, and she'd lost track of time entirely. She did this, sometimes, fell into the archive the way other people fell into fiction. The past pulling at her with a gravity she found more comfortable than the present. She'd looked up at some point to find that it was nearly 9 o'clock, and Constantine was standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, watching her with an expression she didn't have a word for. "You're still here," she said, surprised. "Board meeting that ran late," he said, "and I saw the light." He held out one of the cups. She took it. "What are you working on?" She showed him. They sat at the long table with the correspondence spread between them, and she walked him through what she'd been building. A narrative thread that ran through 40 years of the Vieira Foundation's relationship with the Micmac Cultural Institute. A story about what it meant to fund something without owning it, to give without requiring return. "This should be published," he said when she finished. "It should be preserved first," she said. "Publication comes after the foundation is solid. You sound like my grandfather. You say that like it's an insult." "I say it like it's the highest thing I can think to say," he said. She looked at him across the spread letters, and whatever she'd been avoiding looking at directly, the thing she'd been letting exist in the corner of her vision where it was easier to manage, was suddenly entirely unavoidable. "Freya," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I haven't said anything yet. I know that too." The coffee cooled between them. Outside, the April evening was doing something tentative with the temperature, not warm yet but no longer aggressively cold, the city beginning to remember that it had another season coming. "I don't want to make working here complicated for you," he said. "You're not asking me to do anything," she said. "We're just—" She stopped. "We're just being honest about something." "Yes," he said. "I'd need it to be." She searched for the word, equal. "That's the only thing. I've spent 2 years in something that wasn't equal, and I don't. I need to know that what I think matters. That what I say doesn't need to be managed. What you say," he said, "is frequently the most interesting thing said in any room I'm in." She looked at him, the pale grey eyes. The steadiness that she'd come to understand wasn't coldness, but rather a deep and specific kind of patience. The patience of someone who'd learned early that most things worth having required waiting for. "Okay," she said, the same word she'd said in the ballroom of the Royal York when Owen had left and the air had changed. "Okay meaning, I believe you. Okay meaning, let's see." The spring moved into summer. The archive took shape under Freya's hands, the record of 4 decades organized and protected and made legible. Each file catalogued with the same care she gave everything. The attention that said, "This matters, someone was here, what they did was worth remembering." She was good at her work in a way that was not modest and not boastful, just true, the way being 5'4" was true or being from Hamilton was true, a simple fact that didn't require performance. She and Constantine ate late dinners on the nights they both stayed long at the office, and walked to the car on cold evenings talking about whatever they were thinking, and she met his sister, Petra Vieira Barlow, who was formidably sharp and said, within 10 minutes of meeting Freya, "He's been less of a nightmare to be around since he hired you, and I want you to know I'm grateful." And Freya had liked her immediately. Owen, meanwhile, was not having a good spring. She heard about it from Martin, who heard about it from a colleague whose boyfriend worked in Owen's industry. Owen had submitted a proposal to the Pemberton Foundation for a consulting contract. The foundation had declined politely but definitively after consulting with several of their key donors about whether the partnership aligned with their values. One of those donors, Freya learned later, had spoken to the foundation board at some length about the importance of how people in their network treated others. She did not learn who that donor was, but she had a sense. Later, when she asked Constantine about it directly, Because she needed to be able to ask him things directly, he said. He said what he said to you in a room full of people. The foundation board was deciding whether to give him access to more rooms full of people. I thought they should have complete information. That's not. It's exactly what it looks like, he said without apology. He called you a project, Freya, in public, to a stranger, and he said it the way people say things when they've said them so often they don't notice anymore. He met her eyes. I noticed. She was quiet for a moment. You can't protect me from everything, she said. I know, he said. I'm not trying to. I'm just not pretending that what he did was acceptable, and not expecting you to pretend either. She thought about the bathroom of the Fairmont Royal York, her hand on the marble countertop, the mirror, the dress that fit. The resolve she'd had to build from scratch just to walk back into a room where someone had decided what she was worth and said it out loud, casually, like a footnote. She thought about what it cost to absorb those things. How much quiet work it was, the constant readjusting, the careful management of your own reaction so that nobody had to witness your inconvenient feelings about being reduced. She thought about how Constant had been there in the corner and had not looked away. Okay, she said for the third time, that word that had become between them the simplest form of trust. The Mi'kmaq Cultural Institute exhibition opened in September at a gallery on Spadina, a public presentation of 40 years of correspondence and collaboration, designed by Freya in consultation with the Institute's archivists and knowledge keepers. The visual materials drawn from the collection she'd spent 8 months restoring. It was, the reviews said, a remarkable piece of work. One critic wrote that it was a model for how institutions remember their relationships with indigenous communities, not as beneficiaries but as partners across time. Freya stood at the opening reception, in a deep burgundy dress she'd bought because she liked it and not for any other reason, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching people move through the photographs and letters she'd tended. Martine was there, conspicuously pleased with herself. Petra Vera Barlow was there, speaking to the Institute director with the focused attention of someone who had a great deal of power and used it deliberately. Constantine came to stand beside her. There's a letter in the third room, he said, from 1987. My grandfather is describing a meeting. He writes, I went to speak and she put her hand up gently and said, let me finish my thought first. I stopped. I think it may be the best thing I ever did. Room 3, Case 4, Letter 12. Freya said. I know the letter. I'd never read it before, he said. He never showed me. He was quiet for a moment. He would have liked you. She looked at him. He would have liked your grandmother's nurse, he said, the one who wrote about the smell of the lake. Freya felt something move in her chest. Yeah, she said. I think so too. They stood together in the gallery, the exhibition her hands had made spreading out around them, and the September evening came in through the high windows with the smell of the lake on it, and she thought, here, this, now. She thought about 12-year-old Freya in a house in Hamilton, reading letters in a shoebox, feeling something unlock. She thought about what it meant to take care of things that other people had decided weren't worth saving. The quiet, specific, essential work of it, she thought. Some things you preserve by refusing to let anyone tell you they're not worth the effort. Outside, the city was doing what it did, enormous and ordinary and indifferent and full of people going somewhere. And inside, the record of what had been carefully kept was on the walls, and Freya Dunstan was exactly where she was, exactly the right size for the space she occupied, standing next to someone who had said so from the beginning.